Students often tell me that while they can learn by sketching in biology, it's harder in other classes. I think the real problem is that they haven't yet learned how to turn those concepts and events into sketches that are useful. In this video, I'm going to show you Jane Eyre in sketches. Here's an overview of the plot of Jane Eyre in sketches. Let me walk you through it. Jane Eyre starts as a child, living with her aunt and her cousin. It's not happy. Her cousin is abusive. Jane finally gets angry and hits him. He complains to his mother. Jane gets locked up in a room where she thinks she sees the ghost of her uncle, a good man, but terrifying as a ghost. As a result of saying to her aunt exactly how much she hates her aunt, she gets sent to Lowood School. At Lowood School, she meets Helen Burns, who becomes a good friend, but Helen dies. Jane grows up over a period of 8 years to become a teacher and a respectable young woman. She hungers for more, so she advertises to become a governess. She gets hired at Thornfield Hall to take care of a girl, Adele. Adele is the ward but not child of Rochester. Rochester is away at the beginning, but he comes back to the hall, and over a period of time, he becomes more attracted to Jane. They get closer and further apart. One key event, and there's a fire in Rochester's bedroom. His bed is set on fire, and Jane comes and saves him. For a brief period, they are very close to each other, but the next morning, Rochester is gone before Jane gets up. Jane goes back just to taking care of Adele. A few weeks later, Rochester comes back with another woman, Blanche, who he shows every sign of intending to marry. Jane is increasingly heartbroken, but understands that she's only a governess. There's a mysterious episode in which Mason appears, gets injured, and is sent away. Not long after, Blanche leaves, and Jane is expecting that Rochester is going to be engaged. But instead, Rochester proposes to Jane. These are wedding bells. Jane agrees to marry him. The night before the wedding, Jane wakes up to either a dream or maybe somebody real in her room tearing her wedding veil and looking like an absolute monster. At the church, Mason shows up again with a lawyer, states that Rochester cannot marry Jane because Rochester is already married. The mad woman who was tearing Jane's veil turns out to be Rochester's wife that he's been hiding in the attic. Jane leaves. She flees, leaving no word of where she is, and is taken in by 3 siblings, St. John or St. John, Mary, and Diana. The 3 siblings help to find Jane a place to live and work. She starts teaching in a school. Not long after, we discover that Jane's uncle has died, an uncle she didn't know she had still living, and her uncle left all of his fortune to Jane. Jane comes to realize that Mary, Diana, and St. John are actually her cousins, and she decides to split their fortune 4 ways so that now all of them are comparatively rich. St. John begins to take closer interest in Jane, and he proposes to her. Jane does not love him and knows that St. John does not love her, but St. John keeps arguing that Jane should come with him to India to be a missionary, that there's no higher calling in life. At this point, Jane hears Rochester's voice. Rochester has been continuing without Jane. Jane hears Rochester's voice. She goes to find him. They can get married at this point because it turns out that there was a fire after Jane left at Thornfield. Rochester's wife was killed in the fire. She set the fire and was killed in the fire. Rochester was seriously injured, but still alive. Now, without a wife, Rochester can get married, and they live happily ever after. But that's only one way to read this story. But the fact is that Jane Eyre is also a morality tale. So this version of Jane Eyre has Jane moving between the moral and the right, and the immoral and the wrong. Jane starts as a child without much in the way of morals. She believes that those who persecute her should be punished, to be violent. It is acceptable to state how much she hates the stepmother who is taking care of her, however self-centeredly her stepmother's care is. She's definitely toward the immoral and wrong end of this spread. Jane is sent to Lowood, where she meets Helen Burns. I put Helen close to Jane, but in fact Helen is highly moral, a very good soul who improves Jane. Helen dies in an outbreak of disease. Jane continues at Lowood, gradually improving and eventually becoming a teacher. Now her character is good. She's doing moral things and things that are right, but she also has not been tested. Helen was tested under severe distress and was good under all of those conditions. Jane goes to Thornfield and begins to take care of Adele. Rochester, who's been living an immoral life, finds himself attracted to her goodness, her kindness, and her character. He begins to fall in love with her. He proposes to her, but that proposal is wrong. He's actually married and has been married for a long time to his wife, restrained and protected in the attic. With that proposal, Rochester is descending again into immorality and wrong. Jane is unaware, but on the day of her wedding, when she discovers that Rochester is in fact married, she's nonetheless tempted to stay with him as his mistress or pretend to be his wife. But in the end, her sense of right and wrong wins, and she leaves. She's taken in by Diana and Mary and St. John. Their uncle dies. St. John takes more and more of an interest in Jane and proposes marriage. But St. John is in the wrong. He doesn't love her. He simply wants to use Jane to help him in his missionary work in India. Jane is increasingly tempted by St. John's attempts to convince her that she should become a missionary's wife, his wife in India. St. John will not accept her to go just as a sister. St. John is clearly in the wrong. It's his own ambition that's pushing him, not love. Jane is tempted, but eventually rejects him. She hears Rochester's voice. She goes back to Rochester. Rochester, of course, was in the wrong. The fire set by his wife that burns down Thornfield kills his wife, so he's now single, but he still is in the wrong. It isn't until a long period of time after his injury, when he finally accepts that he should pray to God, that he begins to shift again toward morality. When he calls out to Jane, she comes to find him. Now he is free to marry, and now the two of them can have a moral and right marriage. So these timelines are partly sketches, and I could have added many more events to these sketches, but the two timelines sketched out could help you remember the events and key characters at key moments, but can also be plotted in a different way on the spectrum between immorality and wrong and moral and right.